Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking once again about economics. We specifically are digging into modern monetary theory with the benefit of foresight. I suppose we've had a bunch of conversations on economics with modern monetary theorists who appear to be the only category of economist who's willing to talk to us for some reason. And so we've talked to Steve Keen, Michael Hudson, Yeva Nersesyan, Randall Wray, and Warren Mosler. And today we're sitting down with Bill Mitchell, who is one of the foundational characters in modern monetary theory. And recently on the podcast, we've kind of started doing this frame where we really try to understand the history of the subject. Because, yeah, you can get a collection of facts and you can carry them around in your pocket and be all proud of the fact that you know a bunch of stuff. But knowing a bunch of stuff isn't as powerful as having a story, some kind of frame for what happened and the context in which it occurred to hang those facts on. And so our main question today, as it turned out, was how did the right take over the world? No?
I see it more as what happened to a genuine leftist critique of reality, right? Because I see particularly underscored by our last election cycle, but really it's been going on for 50 years, is you see a left that's increasingly fractioned over somewhat trivial features, right? People squabbling over identity politics and everything in between, but not focusing on what the left should be doing, which is criticizing the income gap or the wealth inequality, the rising gazillionaire class, and the diminishing middle class. That's the job of the left. And there's no political party that actually does that anymore, at least in this country. And it seems like around the world in general. And so that's kind of the background sociological landscape under which all of this monetary theory is playing out. And Bill turned out to have a lot of insight about how this happened. And it kind of goes back to this fracture point in the 1970s, which not causally related, but seems to be pegged to the US leaving the gold standard, which is really fascinating because most of the economists we've talked to have really downplayed the importance of that moment. And it was central to the story that we're talking about today.
Yeah, definitely. And I am nowhere near at the point where I could write you a report where I lay out a full understanding of what happened in global economics for the last 100 years. I don't know that there's anybody that can do that, but I do think that it's really, really important because the economics lens is the lens through which we understand everything else. Our ability to go out into the world and buy the necessities of life to fund the work that we want to do. This is the baseline. In the world of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the economic system in which we live is the base of that pyramid. And I feel really weird not having a better understanding of how the different theories fit together, how they play out against the landscape of historical acts and massive political shifts. And so all of this is in service of trying to understand this story. And obviously, we have so far only really understood the story from the modern monetary theory perspective, but we really want to talk to other people. So if you have recommendations or if you have a connection to other economists, drop them in the comments. We will follow up. We absolutely want to have more of these conversations and get a better picture on what exactly happened in the last century. Why is there not really a left anymore? Why is the right so powerful? How are all these forces shaping our lives as we speak and as we go into the future?
Speaking of economics,
Indeed.
Running this program and running our lives is not a free business, right? It's hard to actually keep everything going. And we have been blessed with a great many patrons at this point who are keeping this show going. We're not selling stuff by random companies. We don't have advertisements. We're just supported by people who listen to the show. And so if you enjoy the program and you have a little bit of money that you can shave off every month, come over and check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/demystifysci. Not only do you support a program face to face and actually put your, motive power where your heart is, but you also get to hang out with people who are interested in the same thing. So we get together once a week, face to face, And we chop it up about all these subjects that we care about, and we sort of orient this ship towards what we should be investigating and who we should talk to. And I'd love to see you be a part of that discussion. You also get early episodes and early access to conference tickets, things like that.
And we have a really exciting announcement to make. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you probably know that we are all about exploring the theories that challenge our conventional understanding of the world. You'll also have heard us and our guests talking endlessly about how difficult it is for the Academy to embrace these often far-out ideas, even in the face of an imminent paradigm failure.
For example, everybody sort of realizes the data streaming out of the James Webb Telescope has kind of pulled the rug out from under the standard model of cosmology. But instead of calling for a new theory, most academics remain hard at work on paradigm repair. Almost all serious alternatives can only find an audience on the fringes. There seems to be no institutional space for a conversation between those two camps.
We believe that a healthier scientific society would include both of these perspectives and more, which is why we're bringing together Alexander Unzicker of Unzicker's Real Physics, Eric Lerner of The Big Bang Never Happened, Gareth Samuel of See the Pattern, Dr. Mike McCullough of Quantized Inertia, Dr. Andrei Kokatoris Assis of the University of Campinas, Dr. C.S. Unikrishnan of the Tata Institute of Technology, Dr. Indranil Banik of the University of Portsmouth, and others to discuss what lies beyond the Big Bang and the crisis in cosmology.
So this June 12th to 16th, DEMYSTICON will meet in Sesimbra, Portugal at a gorgeous seaside hotel for a long weekend, talks, panels, discussions, and mingling. Space is going to be pretty limited, but we really hope you will join us. So check out the links in the description or visit demystifysci.com. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal. Our last conference was a smashing success. I'm really excited to see those of you who made it out last time. It felt really sad to make a bunch of friends and then walk away. But we're doing it again, and hopefully we'll do this every year. So I hope you enjoy the conversation with Bill Mitchell, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
DEMYSTICON podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
The 60s was the turning point in a way. And one of the things that was happening in left theory, in left intellectual world, was the rise of the continental Marxists. And
Are those different from regular Marxists?
oh yeah, because they became postmodernists. So it was the whole abandonment of modernity and the rise of in humanities, the rise of postmodernism, and all this stuff about deconstructing everything down to a micro element, and that really diverted Marxism away from class struggle into identity. It was the beginnings of the identity sort of emphasis. So you had these absurd situations where suddenly, I mean, the classical Marxism was concentrating on economic classes, the organising framework, and identities, you know, gender and race were aspects within that broad organising framework. Whereas the postmodernists sort of broke that apart, and so suddenly you'd get, you know, it was the beginning of feminism. Well, not the beginning, but the resurrection of the 1920s feminism and radical feminists. You know, the women who, the radical women used to say all men are rapists. And I used to say to my girlfriends at the time, you know, not partners, but friends who were girls or women, well, I'm not a rapist. And, you know, they'd say to me, oh, it's only a matter of time. So there was, yeah, I mean, this was radical feminism, and we were all feminists then, but there was this radical element, but it was this emphasis on identity and a breakdown of a concentration on economic class as your starting point. And so the left the intellectual left movement and the activist movements was beginning to splinter in the early 70s. And
would you identify that splintering as this breach between the people who actually understood what the plight of the working class was and the people that were much more intellectually focused? Because it seems apparent that if you change your discourse from being class focused to being identity focused, that must come from some kind of inherent wealth and stability in society, right? Because I feel like the only people who don't want to talk about class are the people that are pretty well off.
yeah, look, you know, I wrote about this the other day. Actually, I'm investigating this sort of professional managerial class issue, and really, it's helping me understand the US election result. And I was taken aback by something I saw from Bernie Sanders, where he said that just before the election, he said, paraphrasing, Harris is bad on Gaza, but Trump will be worse. So therefore, you've got no choice but to vote for Harris. That was sort of his entreaty. And I thought, you fucking bastard, you know, how can you distill the genocide that's going on into Gaza as being a sort of trade-off between and telling people that if they vote for Jill Stein, they're voting for Trump, you know, as if people who don't like Harris and prefer Stein because she's better credentialed on things that really matter to them, like Gaza, that you're telling them, well, this is a democracy, but you don't have a vote. You've got to vote for who we want you to vote for. You don't have a choice. I thought, you know, so I've been investigating all of that idea, and but back in the early 70s, it was quite clear that this sort of middle class leftism had emerged, and the kids in Australia in those days, and even now, to go to university, you've got to be fairly well off. The poor kids in my high school, you know, it's a baby boomer suburb, so lots of kids in those days. Hardly any of us went from the final year. Hardly any of us went to final year, and hardly any of us went to qualified to go to university. Whereas in my partner, she went to a private school and came from middle to upper middle class background. Almost all of those kids went qualified to university. So you go to university as an 18-year-old, and Vietnam War's raging. All the debates about the Cold War is raging, and all of these middle-class leftists at university, or more well off than that, are getting besieged by identity issues because they think postmodernism's clever, whereas the kid, for me, I just thought, well, bloody hell, this is the abandonment of class. But the real turning point came with the oil crisis, because you know, in October 1973, the Saudis retaliated against American military support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. So, you know, America's always repressed the Arabs. through the Israelis since the end of the Second World War. But that was that was the the extension of the illegal occupations of Palestinian territories, and so the retaliation was, okay, we'll just double the oil price overnight and wreck your economies, because all those economies were oil dependent, including America. And that caused such a dislocation in the global economy that the conventional wisdom in economics was abandoned, which was Keynesian thinking. And that gave the loonies like Milton Friedman and the free market lobby the pretext to say, oh, see, all of that post-war government support for the economy, the full employment, all of that support for trade unions, all of that social democratic stuff, that doesn't work. You've got to get the government out of our lives. So that began, as you said, you quoted 50 years. It's about 50 years, isn't it? That began the neoliberal era, which has progressed since then to what it is now, like a horror show. But the interesting point, at that stage of history, is that the left, who were by then starting to fracture on all this identity stuff, and I'd go to, as a young radical, I would go to political economy conferences and sit there listening to extensive discussions about hermeneutics and methodology and ontology and teleology. When unemployment's rising, the poor are getting screwed by the system, by government austerity, as Milton Friedman was taking over the academy. And all of these young radicals are wanting to talk about nuances of ontological perspective and hermeneutics. And I just wanted to talk about smash the system.
So I've heard, I know I should know what hermeneutics is. What is hermeneutics?
Methodology, the way in which scientific paradigms create knowledge.
It sounds so much more occult than that. I was hoping
it's definitely come up on the show before. I also had forgotten what it meant, though. Yeah, I think it's like the change of paradigms.
But is it kind of like the idea of just spending your time counting the number of angels that can fit on the head of a pin, as opposed to actually tackling the questions that are in front of you?
I've used that quote before to describe what was happening. Yeah, I mean, these were interesting conceptual things. It's like playing chess. I love playing chess, and it was chess playing, and the Club of Rome had just come out. The unemployment was starting to rise. There was the breakdown of the Keynesian system. Governments were starting to introduce austerity and cause unemployment to increase, and the left, the progressive left, was talking about structure of paradigms and philosophy of science, which I love, and it's very interesting. But I thought, as a young activist, we should be also talking about smash the state, and so really the left started to sell out, and what happened was that the economic narrative was surrendered. The left intellectuals basically gave up on the macroeconomic debate and accepted all of the monetarist thinking that the government's financially constrained and the bond markets have to be appeased. And the other big thing that had happened, by the way, was in 1971, your president had brought the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system to an end because, US were running significant external deficits, and the rest of the world was building up US dollar reserves, And under the Bretton Woods system, of course, those reserves could be converted on demand into gold stocks at a fixed price. And the US government was pumping a lot of money into prosecution of the Vietnam War. And European governments were starting to worry that the US dollar might lose its value. And as a consequence, all of its holdings of, because they'd built up large stocks of US dollars in their central banks, and they were starting to worry, oh gosh, our reserves might start to lose value if the US government continues to behave in the way it was. And so it was the French initially who started to demand convertibility into gold. And the US government started to fear that they would incur dramatic losses of their gold stocks as foreign countries who were holding all these US dollars would demand conversion. And in August 1971, Richard Nixon was the president before he was driven out through corruption. But he closed in August 1971. He closed the gold window, abandoned convertibility because he feared that Fort Knox would lose its gold stocks. And that ended that system. And so that was a major shock too.
And how did that go? Did people just kind of accept it and move on with business as usual? Because it feels like a really dramatic change to say, hey, we're not going to convert this for gold anymore. And we take for granted now that this is just how it's always been because it's so far outside of living memory for most people. But that must have been a very traumatic and difficult moment in the world.
Well, exchange rates started, most countries floated. And if you've read, if you read this book, this is my 2015 book, that discusses the way in which the European Union dealt with that breakdown in the fixed exchange rate system. And, the European, that's a whole separate story, which would take us hours to discuss. But the Europeans tried to hang on to the fixed exchange rate system, whereas the rest of the world mostly floated. Now, the float, in other words, abandoned fixed exchange rates. And that period in history is very significant, and is why modern monetary theory is called modern, because it describes the way in which the governments who issue their own currencies and float them, what their capacities are. So this began the era of fiat currencies. And suddenly the government, under the fixed exchange rate system, governments were financially constrained because they had to manage the liquidity of their currency because otherwise they'd compromise the central bank's ability to maintain the fixed exchange rate. Now, I can go into that if you want to, but the period after August 71 was incredibly important because it marks the total change in the monetary system. Now, mainstream economists to this day don't recognise that was a significant event, and and almost all of the analysis that you get taught in mainstream economics programs really relates back to the fixed exchange rate system. They never really updated their thinking. That's what differentiates MMT in a way. But the important point I was making was that by about 1974-75, the left-wing economists were essentially agreeing with the monetarists on macroeconomic issues. And they surrendered that terrain of debate. And that's why you now get progressive economists and social democratic political parties and socialist parties in Europe, and British Labor Party, Australian Labor Party, you can't differentiate them very much on macroeconomics from conservatives. And the political debate shifted into identity issues, social housing and stuff like that. But the macroeconomic debate became homogenous, and that's when the left really lost direction.
Interesting. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. So when everybody's on the gold standard, are there multiple types of economic paradigms that are floating around that people are trying to play with? Or is this also an environment where there's a single central philosophy for how economies should work, which are then thrown into chaos by what happens with the oil crisis, giving the opportunity for somebody else to come in? Because you kind of painted the demarcation as being the Keynesians versus the Friedmanites. And so maybe we can take that apart a little bit better.
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, go back to the 1920s and late 1920s, there's the Great Depression began, and the dominant orthodoxy in economic policies was what we call neoclassical, which in modern terms is not much different to free market economics. The policy prescriptions from the British Treasury, for example, was unemployment's starting to rise, therefore you need to cut wages, because it's obvious to a neoclassical economist that wages are too high relative to productivity. So early 30s, the British government started to cut wages. Unemployment got worse. Great Depression deepened. Governments around the world started to wonder what to do. So in America, you had the New Deal, and all the associated programs with that, the youth program and the environment programs and all of those. And at this stage, the academy was starting to reject neoclassical thinking. So this is when John Maynard Keynes came along. And by mid-30s, 1936, he had published his general theory, which was a wholesale rejection of the neoclassical orthodoxy, and demonstrated categorically the flaws in the orthodox paradigm. The Depression really was, and of course Keynes was advocating sort of the things that the New Deal his work had inspired the sort of New Deal, and so more and more of the academic economists were starting to realise that the state had a unique role to play in offsetting the vicissitudes of the private economy, which was driven by expectations and sentiment and optimism and pessimism, and that the only vehicle that could offset the big swings in private spending were government. But the Depression didn't really end until the onset of the Second World War. And at that point, governments really abandoned their conservative approach to budgeting, and because they were building tanks and rifles and to prosecute the war. And full employment obviously returned in 1939 in most countries, not so much in America because America was late coming into the Second World War, but certainly in Europe and Australia and New Zealand and and in Germany, by the way. I mean, Hitler was, for all his venal absurdity, he was a Keynesian. His economic program was admirable. building bigger, investing in infrastructure and housing and employment-generating things.
And so can we say that Keynesianism is sort of the belief that government should be spending on these public works projects and should be aiming at full employment? Is that a fair...
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so get to the war. What we learned from the war was that the way to solve a major depression or a recession that's been driven by private sector spending pessimism, the obvious way to do that is to use the government's spending and taxation capacities. And so when the war proved that, and the challenge at the end of the Second World War was then to translate that insight into peacetime, when you're not investing in tanks and jets and weapons, but you have to find an alternative expression for that spending. And this was the era of the Great White Papers. All around the world, the major country governments brought in these grand statements of nation building. And the Australia was called the White Paper on Full Employment, and it outlined categorically how governments should use its fiscal capacity to ensure that there's always work, that there's Australia wasn't a wealthy country like it is now. And that's when we started to become wealthy. We started to invest in public education, health, transport. All the utilities were government owned, and this was common all around the world.
And is this the first time that the idea of like full employment and employment as this economic goal becomes widespread popular? Or is the idea... go ahead.
Yeah, historically, there's always been a right to work movement going back to the 14th century. And the poorhouses.
But right to work seems bottom up versus full employment seems somehow top down. Is that not the case?
Yeah. I mean, the articulation of the role of the state became really apparent in the 1930s. That up until then, the state was a provider of military, of part of the colonial imperial movement. But it was the 1930s and the 1940s where the role of the state in a sophisticated modern society, as the offset to the fluctuations in private spending, with the goal of achieving functional outcomes, including full employment. This became very apparent in those big nation-building statements following the settlement of the Second World War. And that was each of the countries had different ways of expressing that. So the Scandinavians expressed it in a different way to the Anglo countries, and America really stood out among the Anglo countries as being less supportive of a big state. And in part, that's because the people don't really interact with the state in America as much as they do in say, Australia and Britain. And I learned that from, I asked somebody, where did the expression go postal come from? When people go and shoot someone in the post office in America. And I was told that it's because there's hardly any, the US state has very little interface with the public, and the post office is one of the ways in which the public interface with the government. Whereas in Australia, we were paying our bills for the power company, then we'd interact with the water company and the lands office and the post office and the education department and the health department. All of these things were ways in which we interacted with the state.
So it sounds like you guys had far more opportunities to go postal than the Americans did. Surprisingly different outcome.
We did, yeah. So, but be that as it may, all of the countries accepted this role that the state would behave in that way. And so to answer your original question, it motivated this thread. there was a post-war macroeconomic consensus under the banner of Keynesian thinking. Now that's a loaded term, but that's a separate issue. But broadly speaking, governments took responsibility to build public infrastructure, to maintain jobs maintain jobs by spending more when private sector spending fell, and spend less when private spending was strong. And that was a consensus right through to the early 70s. And so the big paradigm shift came in the early 1970s towards monetarism. So there was a consensus during the post-war period up to the early 70s on what the role of government was, yes.
And so when in the 1970s this starts to fall apart, you pointed to the oil crisis as being the motivating event that gives people the opportunity to jump ship from this paradigm. And so if this paradigm has been working since the onset of World War II, why in the 1970s are people eager to jump ship from it? Is it just because the left has fallen apart and is now, talking about identity politics and arguing about the finer points of like who's more oppressed? Or is it because Keynesian economics has stopped working? Or is it some other third thing that's mysterious and not on the table yet? Like why does Friedman become so popular if not for the CIA?
Inflation's the reason, and let me explain that. So up until the 1970s, after the Second World War, first of all, the Keynesians had a view of inflation that was demand side. So the Keynesian framework could understand inflation if it came from excessive spending. So if spending outstripped the capacity of the supply side to supply goods and services in response, then you would get price rationing through inflation of that spending. So Keynes talked about the inflation gap. So if there was excessive spending, you would get inflation. Keynesians understood that. And of course, the whole conduct of fiscal policy in the post-war period was to manage spending so that it didn't push through that ceiling, but was sufficient to keep everybody employed. So that was a sort of art form. Policymakers were always, balancing the odds, and the government departments, like the employment departments around the world, including in America, had very sophisticated what they call manpower planning divisions. And that was just the manpower was just because of the domination of males in the workforce at that era. It was just a cultural thing. But the manpower plannings were very sophisticated, forward-thinking frameworks to say, well, what industries are going to be growing and declining, and what apprentices and trained labour will we need to have in place so that we don't get shortages and gluts. And that was all to do with managing this inflation ceiling. The problem with the oil crisis, now Milton Friedman up until then had been saying, too much spending is going to always be inflationary. And the problem with the oil crisis was that it wasn't a demand shock, it was a supply shock. So suddenly the raw material price of oil that countries who were dependent on imported oil were had to suddenly endure, that created a ruction, because if your imported oil price is rising and your costs of production are rising, well, then in terms of the real income that your economy is producing is now lower, because some of it has to go to the rest of the world, the Saudis, in other words, to pay for the oil price rise. And so the question then became for countries, well, who's going to share in that real income loss domestically? Is it going to be labour or is it going to be capital? And so there was, and at that time, remember that trade unions were still quite powerful. They hadn't been gutted yet. And so they had the ability to resist cuts to their real income by industrial action to push up wages. And of course, on the side of capital, capitalism had become quite concentrated. In other words, monopoly power was quite entrenched. And so that meant that those firms had price-setting power. They weren't free market firms. And so what happened was that in trying to mediate who was going to, just hang on. Sorry, I'm in a meeting. See ya. Sorry about that. So in terms of mediating who was going to take those real income losses, a lot of the struggle over that became quite dysfunctional. And the governments responded by introducing austerity because, in other words, they worked out that by creating unemployment, you could reduce the intent of the trade unions to keep pushing up nominal wage demands, and you killed off sales for firms, and that reduced their incentive to keep passing on pushing up prices. And that's why inflation accelerated at that time. But it was largely a supply shock. Now, the Keynesian economists couldn't deal with that. And the monetarists, of course, they were very dishonest because they said, oh, we told you so. Here's all this inflation. And the reason there's this inflation is because governments have been running these deficits for too long. Now, that wasn't the reason there was inflation. The inflation was because of the cartel power of OPEC engaging in a political action against the US for supporting Israel in the oppression of Arabs and stealing of Arab territory. But the monetarists were able to conflate the inflation of what they were saying, that our deficits are bad, because the monetarists wanted free markets. They wanted to get rid of regulation, big government, and push the power back into the corporations. And they hated social democracy. And so the monetarists were able at that period to take the inflationary event and then sell that to the ignorant public as being a outcome of all these deficits and social democracy, and see, we told you so. Now, the Keynesians had no understanding of supply side shocks. So because there hadn't really been very many supply side shocks in that whole period of stability after the Second World War. And the only people that really understood it properly were the Marxists, by the way, because there was a whole series of theoretical articles in the Monthly Review, which was an American journal that left-wingers wrote in, describing what was building a theory called the conflict theory of inflation. And the conflict theory of inflation was really saying inflation arises out of class struggle. So this was the struggle over who was going to take the real income losses of the imported oil price rises. And the class struggle was facilitated by strong unions and monopoly firms and corporations. And the inflation was allowed to accelerate because governments were initially scared to death of creating unemployment because they were still in the full employment era. And so you got this conflict theory of inflation, that inflation's really nothing to do with monetarist ideas, but to do with the embedded tensions in the class struggle. So that was really sidelined and a minority view. But that was the view that I had, by the way, and I took that to my PhD. But to answer your question, that's why Milton Friedman was so successful. He exploited a ruction, an accelerating an inflation crisis, and then was able to construct that crisis in terms of his own thinking, which was quite illegitimate. But the rest of us, the public, didn't have a clue.
Mm.
Friedman was tied into the whole shock doctrine story too, right? With the overthrow of different democratically elected governments in South America, Central America, around that time period. How does that knit together?
Well, go back to 1971, and this is before the inflation shock. And during the 60s, there was mounting resistance by the corporate sectors to what we might say is the more equal sharing of the exploits of production, of income, because trade unions and social democracy was built on the idea of equity and sharing out the booty. And of course, because of the political environment, the rest of us were really supportive of that through our voting intentions. And so we supported governments that were social democratic in their leanings, but the corporations and the elite, the capital elites, hated that. But they had, short of taking over a military coup, they had no traction. They had less traction than they have now. And well, in 1971, Lewis Powell, who had been hired by the US Chamber of Commerce, funded by the likes of the Koch brothers and all of this, the big American, what we now know are, the right-wing American capital interests. They funded Lewis Powell to come up with a manifesto to reverse those social democratic outcomes. And he published his Powell Manifesto, it was called, the Powell Doctrine. And not long after that, Richard Nixon appointed him to the Supreme Court. And as I understand it, he became one of the most conservative judges in Supreme Court history. So he was a piece of work from a left perspective. But the Powell Manifesto was a blueprint for the way in which capital could take back control of the distribution system and wind back social democracy. So elements of the Powell Manifesto, and it's publicly available, you can read it, were the capital had to fund the creation of think tanks. So in that era, you saw the development of think tanks in America and around the world, and these were held out as sort of research institutes, and the American Enterprise Institute and the Cato Institute and all of these type of places. They were held out as public research.
The Rand Corporation too, right? Like this is around the era when Rand Corporation was the think tank that was actually issuing PhDs, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
It was all of those institutions arose at that time, and they were held out as sort of research institutes, independent, authoritative research institutes, but they were just elaborate and very well-funded propaganda and marketing exercises. And of course, the left couldn't do anything like that because they didn't have the funds. So that was the first part of the Powell Manifesto. The second part was to take over the media. And so you saw the development of Fox News and these rabid pop right-wing sort of national news broadcasting, Sky News in Britain, in Australia, Sky News, the takeover of a lot of the newspapers. So News Corp grew in power. You know, it was an Australian company originally. Murdoch shifted to the US and created Fox News and take over the newspaper, you know, the mainstream newspapers and converting them. The Power Manifesto urged capital to infiltrate education institutions, and so you started to see the rise in endowed chairs and research funding into universities from big corporations, and manipulating curriculum and sitting on school boards and manipulating what was being taught to students. And so, you know, this was an elaborate strategic investment plan with execution that capital had initiated to take back control. And of course, the monetarist incursion into the academy took control of the academy, and you had sort of the left were left, you know, bereft. They just had no idea how to deal with any of that, because the left is typically not very well organised. Capital, the right has got an excellent capacity to suppress personal enmities and nuances and pursue a theme in a very unidirectional way, whereas the left gets obsessed with factions and all sorts of personal enmities and stuff, and this gets diverted all the time. But moreover, the left just had no funding, didn't have the financial capacity to mount that sort of thing. And so, in relation to your question, the other thing that the Power Manifesto and its subsequent expressions led to were those military efforts and undermining of social democracies in Latin America and Central America. You know, I often say a great event happened on Tuesday, September the 11th. And it's a really interesting exercise. So when I'm talking to left audiences, I sometimes have said, you know, and it's particularly around that date, I say, you know, we remember the terrible travesty on Tuesday morning, September the 11th. And I know what they're thinking. And I say, you know, it was when you know, good people were murdered and by destructive forces. And I know they're thinking about September the 11th, 2001. And then I say to them, yeah, September the 11th, 1973, Tuesday morning, when the CIA sponsored the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile, and Salvatore and General Pinochet took over and declared a military state. And he immediately hired the PhD students from Chicago, who were Milton Friedman's graduates, and they were called the Chicago Boys. And they brought in the most pernicious neoliberalism you could ever imagine, as well as all the disappearing of the radicals out and the helicopter drops out into the ocean of the radicals and the murder of the radicals. They brought in the first expression of Milton Friedman's free market thinking. And of course, it was a total disaster. But that was the way in which the US capital spread its tentacles into other countries to perpetuate or introduce what, you know, the American politicians say, we're bringing freedom and democracy to the rest of the world. well, all they were bringing was oppression and authoritarian military rule and a destruction of social justice in those countries. But it was all tied into this restatement of American exceptionalism that in the economics was was expressed by monetarism.
Hey, pardon the interruption. I need to remind you that our program is entirely paid for by listeners. So if you enjoy what you're listening to, consider putting a couple of dollars down and supporting this project directly. Not through advertisements, not through sponsorships, not through us selling stuff we don't care about, but directly through you, dear listener, over at patreon.com/demystifysci. Going back to this OPEC cabal, which is a really fascinating take on the whole thing, they kind of kicked this all off, and then that the Milton Friedman crew was able to use that to unleash an entirely new program that people hadn't been on board with before. What was their motivation? Like, I understand that they took advantage of that event in this reading, but were they just motivated by their corporate sponsors, or who are these people? Like, what's their... Do they believe they're doing the right thing for Western society, or are they just looking out for themselves? What can you get into the minds of these people a little bit?
Well, I mean, I studied with them, and I've been an academic with them. I've been in academic departments dominated by them. One of the interesting research things that I've read in over the years is this idea that the idea of self-selection into academic programs. And one of the things that appears to be true is that so when they've done surveys of students to ascertain their values and their opinions and whatever, the economic students tend to stand out. And so they begin their undergraduate training with sort of poorly formed views about individuality and equity. They're not happy with equity. They have poorly formed views about, individual, the exercise of individual discretion and effort, and then by third year of their undergraduate years, they're starting to exhibit what we call socio-pathological tendencies. They're starting to eulogize the values of greed and individuality and individual enterprise, and starting to take on views that that poverty is you're not a victim of poverty. You've created your own poverty through laziness and through indolence and lack of investment in yourself, and that unemployment's a chosen state, not because there's a lack of jobs, but because someone's chosen the value of leisure is higher than the value to them of work. And, and this is reinforced in the undergraduate program, particularly in microeconomics, which is dominated by neoclassical thinking. That, I remember when I was a student in second year of university studying economics, when I went back, the textbook discussed the division between welfare-dependent individuals and robustly independent individuals. So all this terminology and nomenclature and framing was all about building a view in the students learning it, that poverty was a choice, and you were going to be successful and well off because you were robust and dedicated and you weren't lazy. And the sort of downplay of nurture, your background, your social background, and the downplaying of your environmental factors as being determinant of where you were as a young adult going into adult life was really significant. You know, the downplaying of class and all of that. So what was their mindset? Well, they were conditioned, you know, economists, that's the profession, they're trained in that sort of thinking, and it's pernicious. Now, how some people get through that like me is a good question, but and the other point I made at the beginning was about self-selection. It's probable that people who are attracted to this academic program and training are of that ilk anyway, probably through family circumstance or something. But the propaganda becomes intense in postgraduate training. And that's when you really become formed into this sort of almost a socio-pathological unit.
It's an intensely compelling ideology, propaganda ideology, right? That if you work really hard, everything will work out for you. And therefore, if things don't work out for you, you must not be working hard enough. And, you know, it's funny because on its face, like, that seems to make sense, but then you start actually living your life, especially as an artist. Like, you're a musician also. I've been a musician my whole life, and I spent many years like working in that field semi-professionally. And honestly, like, some of the hardest working people I know to this day are musicians, but they're also some of the poorest people I know, which is really funny because that's like a very archetypical instance of a situation where output does not necessarily result in income. And at the same time, there are so many people who, well, I don't know about, I'd say an increasing amount of people who are getting completely rich off of this transactional financialization industry, who are doing very, very little by way of generating anything new and use, like, what would we say, productive in the world.
I think you can solidly make the argument that somebody who makes beautiful music makes something that enriches the commons. Somebody who is an artist and is transmuting the experience of being alive into something that moves the soul is doing a service, is providing a service. And somebody who's just making money off of some kind of obscure financial transaction where they're screwing somebody on one end of it out of their life savings, like, it's pretty easy to paint.
They're getting rich too, right? And it's not just music artists, right? Artists are a great example, but also, you know, we've met lots of venue owners, scientists. Like, there's people who are just working extremely hard, and you don't have to look that far to see counterexamples to this situation. Now, are there people who also just don't do anything and they're poor as the result? Of course. I think it's both cases are true, but it's a shame to fall into any ideology that leads you to believe that the cause and the effect are so tightly linked that the pursuit of wealth is going to somehow be your savior in this situation.
Well, I've always thought that we live in a society in the United States where everybody feels like they're a temporarily embarrassed billionaire. Like that riches are just around the corner, and if the dice roll of fate was slightly different, that they would be the ones that were up on the pedestal being showered in champagne. And I'm like, I don't think that's true. And I think that there's been like a very coherent move to make people believe that that's the case, that this explosion into vast power and riches is just around the corner. And I don't totally know. And I don't totally know where that came from, and I have a feeling that that belief is what causes people to have so much psychological friction about aiding the poor and social programs and the responsibility of government and government spending and everything else, because they're like, well, I'm going to be rich soon and I don't want to have my money taken away in order to pay for the kinds of poor people that I used to be. And so perhaps we should just abandon this altogether.
Yeah, I mean the lower income cohorts, they don't really have a voice. They've historically never had a voice. But what the post-war period created was a middle class, and particularly with the spread of public education, mass education, it created an educated middle class. But the problem was that the middle class were were seduced and bought off by mass consumption. So if you go back and think about, America in the 1950s, with the mass advertising of all of the white goods, you'd be watching TV in America, in Australia too, by the way. But, and this ideal family would have all these white goods and big cars and boats, and we got seduced by mass consumption, the middle class, and that kept us, even though we were educated and we had a voice, that voice was channeled by mass consumption, and we became tied up in home mortgages, which meant that home ownership, which meant that we had to maintain stability of income, otherwise we'd lose everything. And of course, that led to the company man, the guy who would work in authoritarian workplaces and shut up because they had stable work and they challenged authority, they'd lose out. So that mass consumption then gave way in the 70s to the sort of Milton Friedman trickle-down nonsense. And this is what you're referring to, this idea that, there was propaganda, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, that book, and all of the think tanks were pumping this stuff out that if you worked hard, you'd make it. And, this was an opportunity world, and that don't have envy for the rich, because the rich are where you're going to be, and the rich's endeavours are going to trickle down to all of us, and all you had to do is keep your chin up and work hard, and you'd get there too. And of course, the corollary of that is that if you hadn't made it by now, then you weren't trying hard enough, and that it was all on you. And so, a nomenclature emerged. And in Australia, for example, we started in 1974, the term dole bludger became really often used in the media, and you'd have these media companies, like Fox News type media companies, who would be outside poor people's homes, going through their rubbish bins, saying, "Look what they've been eating. Look what they're just living it up, and they're not working." And this dole bludger nomenclature, that you were just a bludger on unemployment income support, and you were living the high life on government support, and you weren't contributing. This is because, despite the fact there weren't enough jobs to go around because of the austerity, and not everybody could work anyway because there weren't enough jobs. But yeah, so that trickle down had incredibly powerful resonance in the way the middle class started to think about poverty, and just a shocking abuse of knowledge and concepts, but it was very powerful.
Can you lay out a little bit more of what happened with austerity? Because before the break, I've just been like scrolling things down. So what you were saying is that there was a supply side shock when the oil crisis happens. And the way that governments deal with it is by implementing all of these austerity programs, which make things worse rather than better. And so I wonder if you can tell us what it is that they thought that the austerity programs were gonna do and what they actually did, and how we know the real cause and effect there.
Well, what they say and what they think are two different things, I think. It's quite clear to me that in that period we were talking, the sort of early mid-70s, which is when sort of the current dominant paradigm emerged in economic thinking, that the academy was being bought off by capital, in my view. The Power Manifesto and what I talked about before. And it was quite clear that capital had a concerted plan to regain more of the income being produced. They thought that there was too much equality.
And when you say capital, we're referring literally to the people that are the owners of companies and who are the majority stockholders, like board members. Are there specific people that you're envisioning when you say capital, or is it just kind of a class of the fat cat, like bags with dollar signs on them types?
Yeah, I don't really want to get into hold myself out as a conspiracy theorist.
We'd welcome it if you wanted to.
No, I know you wouldn't. But the reality is that there's a cabal. I mean, that's the point. There's interlocking directorates. There's golf clubs. I remember I said before I liked to play golf, and at one point, a very rich American who was attracted to my work took me to a very wealthy golf club in Florida. And this was a place that the likes of me would never have been able to enter. I think sandwiches were $100 at the sandwich bar. It was one of those sort of places in Florida. And we went to the warm-up area where you wait to go onto the golf course, and you hit a few shots to get your back organised. And, this guy said, I won't name names, but he as we were walking onto this area, the warm-up area, he said, and I'm making up names, but he said, "G'day, Rao." And I said, "Who's Rao?" And he said, he's executive of X company. So one of the leading companies. Enron was one of the companies, by the way, before Enron sort of fell into disrepute. And then he'd say, "G'day, Bob." And Bob turns out to be the boss of some other huge conglomerate. And "G'day, Alan." And, and what was quite clear was, and I said to this guy out later when we're having these expensive sandwiches, what goes on in these clubs? And he said, this is where we do all our deals. This is where all the business is transacted. And, so you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to know that there's networks. It's quite clear there's networks. Capital has networks. They share a common interest. They're willing to compromise their own individual pursuits for the class interest quite often. And their individual interests are sort of blurred anyway because of the interlocking directorates. So and it's quite clear from history and what we've seen is that the funding of the political lobbying movements, which was their way to manipulate legislation, the political process. You just have to, look at the log of the lobbying. In America, there's quite an elaborate website where you can see who's paid which politician what, and then you can track what that politician, how they voted in different legislative bill votes. You put it together and it's quite clear that they vote in favour of those who pay them the most money. So all of that was going on for sure.
And so what are the policies that this wealthy class is advocating for the government to take on, and what are the effects of those policies? Like, what does austerity actually mean on the ground?
Well, I mean, it wasn't just fiscal policy that was changing in that period. We started to get, in Australia, for example, and you can find this in every country, you started to see very pernicious industrial relations legislation coming in. So trade unions were effectively banned in Australia for secondary boycotts. Now, what are secondary boycotts were very important because this was a classic example was the Myall Lakes campaign. So the Myall Lakes is this beautiful natural lake area in New South Wales, Australia. And the trade unions banded together to save them from environmental destruction. And they used their industrial clout to bring costs to the economy to force governments to change their policies. And they did. There was a number of examples where they saved historic buildings and what have you. They were called secondary actions. They were declared illegal. You could no longer mount an industrial campaign in something that's not directly related to your industry. And it went on to the point that trade unions virtually have no capacity to engage in inflict costs on society anymore. So that's not fiscal policy, that's industrial policy. And, in Australia, they force governments to abandon social housing effectively and privatise the provision of low-income housing. They demanded governments privatise public utilities like gas, water. They forced governments to fund private education and reduce the per head funding to state education. And it goes on and on and on. And that was all a concerted campaign to push more resources into the private domain and private decision-making and discretion. But the interesting thing was that while they were attacking government's capacity to fund welfare and public education and public health, the capital remained and still remains dependent on government procurement contracts. So, the private education in Australia is dependent on, private health system is dependent on government funding. But it's no longer serving the interests of the public, but serving the interests of the shareholders of those firms. So that's what they were doing. Now, austerity was, there's never austerity when the military industrial complex needs funding. There's austerity when there's government employment programs or public education or public health, or, you've got austerity abandoning national dental schemes. That's fine. That's because the government will run out of money. But when the government's funding massive military equipment to send to Israel, well, that's fine. That's never mentioned. So I think you can say that it wasn't just a series of random events. It was a concerted, planned, strategic way in which the right, and we dealt with this in this book, 2017 book,
Reclaiming the State.
Yeah, we dealt with that in there, where the left were persuaded to believe that global capital had compromised the ability of the state to operate in a discretionary way, whereas the right knew all along that if it wanted to pursue its agenda, it had to reconfigure the state, not eliminate the state. The state is still very powerful, and most of the stuff that we call neoliberal outcomes have emerged through the legislative power or regulative power of the state. And the state hasn't disappeared; it's just been reconfigured to support the interests of capital. And in that post-war period, the state was really a mediator between the class conflict. So tried to keep capital and labour from killing themselves and therefore wrecking the economy. Whereas in the post-70 period, the state has become a agent for capital. That's the difference.
And what was the role of the monetarists? I mean, we've kind of we've already established that the capitalists were the ones that were pushing the austerity measures, but what was it philosophically about their view on monetary policy that induced them to take these actions, as opposed to perhaps the way that modern monetary theory would have looked at the same situation?
Well, I mean, the monetarists and their subsequent iterations were extremely successful in selling to the public that the government is like a household, that the national currency and government is really like a household. And of course, they encouraged us then to extrapolate our experience as households to an understanding of what the capacities and opportunities of our national governments might be. So if we thought about our national governments as a big household, well then, and we applied our experience as households to that domain, then we'd come up with a series of understandings. And the understandings we'd come up with are, well, I'm a household and I have to work. I'm working today, even though I'm giving you my labour for free, I'm earning income. If I want to spend, I have to work, or I have to use prior savings, or I have to borrow money if it's something like a house mortgage. In other words, I understand fully that I have to work out funding sources before I can spend because I'm financially constrained, and I can run out of money if I'm indiscreet. If I spend too much on my credit card, I can run into financial problems at the end of the month. If I lose my job, I'm going to find it hard paying my home mortgage. And these are all things that, every household, more or less, depending, more if you're a higher income person, less if you're a lower income person, the constraint hits earlier. But more or less we understand that's our lot in life, that we have a financing problem. And then we are encouraged by the mainstream economists, beginning with the monetarists, to extrapolate that into the way we think about governments. And so we are easily persuaded that the government can spend too much money. And if it spends too much money, it's going to run into troubles. It could run out of money and then there'd be catastrophe. And if it spends too much money, ultimately it has to pay the piper. And who's the piper? The taxpayer, that we would have to that it's our tax. We're encouraged to believe it's our taxes that the government is spending, and that how dare they spend it on all of these programs, these vanity programs that we, how dare they spend it on a lazy bastard who's unemployed, who just should get off their behind and go and work like I am. And how dare they help someone who's not willing to help themselves, and all the rest of it. This is an elaborate cause and effect that we've been encouraged to embrace, and that then affects our voting patterns. Now, the reality, of course, is that it's all a fiction, that the capacities and opportunities and constraints facing the national government have no correspondence with the household, because we're financially constrained and they're not. They issue their own currency. We use their currency. We've got to get it somehow. They don't have to get it somehow. They just create it out of thin air. So the monetarists were incredibly successful into scaring the hell out of us into being biased towards low deficits or no deficits, because how are we ever going to pay those deficits back? Well, you are going to pay it back by higher taxes. They're going to take money off you and your children. They're wasting money on vanity projects and, all of this stuff. And it's pumped out by the think tanks and the conservative press, and the pollies get up there and pump it out. And, well, we're an ignorant public. We don't know. All these economists with PhDs come out and say it. Well, who are we to question their authority? And that's why this has been so successful.
And it's worth pointing out, like, for people who are listening to this, if you want a good overview, we've had a number of conversations with MMT economists.
I actually just wrote down the list while I was thinking of saying this. We've had Yeva Nersessian on, we've had Michael Hudson, we've had Warren Mosler and Randall Wright.
Steve Keen, yeah. And the one thing that keeps coming up over and over in those conversations, I don't claim to fully grasp modern monetary theory, but I do understand that the argument has risen up several times that the money from taxes is not the same money that is going into government spending, despite the fact this is what you hear all of the time during the election cycles. That seems to be a fundamental mythos that is constantly being attacked by MMT theorists. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, that's one of the elements of the fiction, that that a currency issuing government doesn't need any funding. And so the first question that arises then is, well, why do they issue taxes? Why do they force us to pay taxes? Well, then you have to understand the role of taxation. And but I do simple examples with people. Imagine that that this little Zoom session becomes my country, and you're the non-government and I'm the government. And to live in this country, to stop you being banished from your own Zoom session, I impose a tax obligation on you. And of course, this Zoom session now doesn't use US dollars or Australian dollars. It uses bill dollars, my own currency. So I now say, okay, well, you're going to be expelled unless you pay 100 bill dollars a week. Now, what problem have you got?
Where do I get those bill dollars? Yeah.
Exactly. First question you're going to ask is, where do you get them from? Well, the only place you can get them from is from me, the government.
So I got to join your army or something. I got to do something to get that money.
Well, I'm not going to have an army. I'm going to have a core. I'm going to have a core of minstrels.
Sounds great. I'll take a job.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to create employment and hire people to paint and play music and care for each other, and I'm going to pay you $100, bill dollars. And at that point, you are able to fund your tax liability. You've been able to get the money from me. So it's just logic 101. If you've done logic 101, a cause has to come before an event to be causal. Can't come after it. So I didn't need your taxpayer dollars to hire you to wander around playing guitar.
No, but there is this like weird back and forth relationship, right? Because in order for me to agree to wander around to play guitar for you, I have to accept your authority, number one, right? I have to
You do.
accept that like the bill dollars are somehow meaningful and that I want to stay in this, to continue the metaphor, that I want to stay in the Zoom meeting, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
and I have to trust that you're going to give me the bill dollars and that
Yep.
like you're probably going to give me more bill dollars than you want at the end of the year, right? And so then there's also the secondary thing of like, well, I haven't just made my bill dollars to return the debt to you. I've also made enough to be able to go and spend on, I don't know, hand pies at the tavern or whatever it is I'm into.
No, I'm not. If I'm a responsible government in this Zoom session, I'm not going to spend more than I want. I'm going to spend sufficient. If I'm responsible, I'm going to make available sufficient of my currency so that everybody who wants to work can find meaningful and contributing work. And when I've got to that point, that's the end of my injection of bill dollars. So I'm not going to spend more than I want at the end of the year. I'm going to make sure that I've got a society that's functioning and that everybody who wants to contribute through work can do that. And those who can't contribute through work for whatever reason, disability, age, whatever, is looked after in a sophisticated, meaningful way. That's it.
So the part that I'm like,
Hold on. I didn't finish. Yeah, but the whole point of a currency is coercion, and you write, that I have to ensure that my tax liability sticks. I have to ensure that that tax liability is meaningful, and if I can't enforce that tax liability, then my currency won't be acceptable. That's true. So we have all sorts of mechanisms to do that. I could have an authoritative mechanism with a dictatorship and a military, or I can have a sophisticated, educated society where I encourage people to be societal members, and that as government, I'm an agent working in their interests to pursue things that individually we can't pursue ourselves, like public education and public health. So there's various ways I can create that trust and that and express that coercive element. But that's the at the end of the day, governments have to be trusted and have to be obeyed. That's true.
so when we've had conversations with all of these people that I listed, and at the end of those conversations, I always walk away and I'm like, okay, so it makes perfect sense that because of this organization of the flow of money from the government to the people, that the government is able to create the money on its balance sheets, hand it out to people, and at the end of the year say, okay, bring it back. And we have this goal of full employment, which is that everybody who wants to have a job in the society has a job, and if the private sector isn't funding those jobs, then the government steps in and uses its ability to create money to fund the jobs. And as far as I can tell, one of the ways in which the government funds jobs is that contractors and various other people will come and give them bids for how much it costs to build something, right? Because the government's not dealing with like the nitty-gritty payroll of every single bridge and telephone pole it has to put up. It trusts that there's an organization that takes care of this. And so the thing that I always come down to is I'm like, how does a system like modern monetary theory deal with the inherent presence of grift, where At this point, if there is this sense that there is a limit to how much the government can spend on a given project because it doesn't have the ability to continue adding zeros to the checks that it writes, there's a de facto peak to how much someone can quote for a job because the government's like, well, this is what we have. We can't spend more than this. And so one thing that I keep just gnawing on with modern monetary theory is I'm like, how do you prevent astronomical costs by those that are petitioning the government to fund these jobs that are so central to the theory?
Yeah. So there's several points. First point is that when you open by saying our objective is full employment, and you married that into the understanding of the monetary system, and the two things shouldn't be married together. That's the first point. Now, I introduced this terminology a while, like way back, that MMT is not a system. You used the word system, and MMT is not a regime. MMT is a lens. So I conceive with these, and MMT is a lens for understanding more clearly the way in which the modern monetary system operates, the capacities of the currency issuer within that system, and the opportunities it has, and the consequences of using that capacity in different ways. So it's not a lens, it's not a regime, there's not a policy set. If you understand MMT, you don't necessarily want to have full employment. And so to translate that lens level into policy space, you need to impose an ideology, a set of values. And so the point is that a lot of people say, oh, MMT is leftist in thinking. Well, no, it's not. I'm leftist. I'm a founder of MMT. I'm leftist. But you could easily be an extreme right-winger and still understand the world from an MMT lens. And the policy space that I would come up with as a result of my understanding of the monetary system, my MMT dimension, will be quite different to a policy space that a person with the same MMT understanding would have if they had a right-wing ideology. So that's the first point, to really get straight that when we talk about policy, you can't conflate that back to MMT. The MMT, the policy is your set of values and ideology. Now, the second thing is that there's this fantastic quote from some years ago. Cambridge University were celebrating, I think, 50 years of Keynes. So it was in the late 80s. And they interviewed sort of esteemed economists of the era. And one person they interviewed was Paul Samuelson, who was the sort of doyen of from MIT, the doyen of sort of American-style Keynesian thinking. But really he was a neoclassicist. And what Paul Samuelson told the interviewer was along the lines of, yes, we've created a fictional world around our discussions of fiscal policy and government budgets. And the reason we've done that, in other words, we tell lies about the budgetary capacity of the American government. And the reason we've done that is because for social stability reasons. And he went on to explain that just as religion has been a vehicle to keep people in check, so fear of God, mainstream economics tells these lies and creates these fictions to stop everybody demanding everything all at once. In other words, to stop unsustainable demands on government spending, because if everybody understood that the government had no financial constraints, well, then the lineup for the doling out government largesse would become unsustainable. So that's the second point. The third point then moves further into that. How do we stop corruption and payola? And you used the word grift. It's sort of an American word, but
we're very good at it.
Yeah, I know. We share the language, but we have different terminology. But grift I can work with. And the answer is, well, you've got to have governance. You've got to have checks and balances, and you can't eliminate it completely. But is that sufficient reason to then abandon government responsibility to reduce poverty just because? And I've often used the example that, so in the 70s, I mentioned the term dole bludger became nomenclature in Australia, and
I think we had welfare queens here is the same thing.
Welfare queens, yeah. Yeah, it's the same sort of sentiment. And when academic researchers have gone out among the unemployed in Australia, for example, and done, very solid qualitative research, investigating the sentiment of the unemployed, what their aspirations were, etc., 98% answer of people on income support answer that we really would love a job tomorrow. If we were offered a job tomorrow, that'd be great. And 2% admit that they like living on income support. They've worked out even though it's low income, it's below the poverty line, they've worked out they can get into share houses and, communes and dope nests and whatever. But they admit that they are liking that lifestyle. It's been forced on them by a lack of jobs, but they've evolved and adapted to that to survive. And so, 2% are acting like the mainstream claim that they have chosen to be that way because of the income support. But does that mean, and probably a percentage of procurement, government contract recipients and pursuers in the corporate sector, probably a lot of them are cheats as well. But do you design policy that's intended to advance the well-being of society? Do you design that exclusively on the basis of that there's going to be some people out there who are corrupt? And I don't think that's the way to deal with it. That's too pessimistic. And I think if we can, America landed a man on the moon in, when was that, 1968? I was
allegedly.
Yeah, well, that's right. But I can tell you, I was at high school and we were marshalled into a big room with a TV screen and we watched it. So, but the point was, imagine the physics knowledge then and the knowledge of astronomers and that was a massive, if it was true, it was an incredible feat. Now, if we can do that, more than 50 years ago, then we can design governance surrounding public policy to reduce grift and cheating. That's my view.
I hope so. I mean, I think that the reason that I'm a little bit skeptical and worried about it is because I look at what's happened to something like the university system or the medical system or any of these institutions that have been around since, honestly, like roughly World War II, where administrative costs have ballooned, and now you have universities no longer really paying their professors very well, and instead this team of administrators, I always like to point to this hilarious thing that happened to Shiloh, where he's teaching astronomy at the university at the next town over, and he had to go through this bureaucratic rigmarole in order to get his course in the right bin on the schedule for the next year, so that it was like a general education course. And he went through the entire thing, like committee after committee after committee. Someone somewhere in the unbelievable sea of committees like dropped the ball. And so when they finally published the course, it was published for the wrong number of credits. And then when Shiloh was like, okay, well, you screwed up for this semester, surely we can just fix it for the next semester. They were like, no, the committee that decides that only meets once a year. And so that's a no-go, we can't fix it. And I was looking over his shoulder, and he got an email like the day after from some other administrator about the committee on committees meeting next week in order to be able to organize some other subset of committees. And it drives home the point of how absurd this has gotten, where institutions that are old enough seem to just accumulate people that take money for some obscure function, and they make work and they fulfill their job, but they're not actually like providing value for the system. And so I'm like, if that is the inherent arc of institutions, where sure, it's happening at the university that's nearby, but it's also happening at other larger universities. This appears to be a universal motion of publicly funded institutions. And so I'm like, surely we must have to take this into account when designing an economic system, because we see it happening all around us, where things are just breaking in terribly banal, bureaucratic ways.
Yeah, but see, you said that these are long-standing historical institutions, and in name that's true, but the institutions have evolved with the ideology of the dominant ideology. So we've gone from the public service, for example, the public service in Australia and in most in most countries, America is slightly different, but in most countries, public service was public sector providing services through that post-war period. Public education, public health, all of the different services, marriages, births and deaths, and all of these things. Now, when the paradigm shifted with the monetarists and the free market stuff emerged, progressively those public service departments, which are still Department of Housing or Department of Environment, became contract brokers rather than service providers, became contract brokers for the privatised delivery or the outsourced delivery of services. So yeah, the Department of Housing still exists, and it's got a long-standing institutional structure, but it's no longer the same department. And same as the universities. That, you know, I've been in universities all my career, effectively. And I've seen a dramatic change in the structure of universities to increased the evolution of KPIs as the targets, the massive growth in the managerial class within the universities, doing busy work to justify themselves, the sort of stuff that you were referring to, this absurd committee structures, the abandonment of academic control of universities in favour of professional managers. So we all had, as part of our academic career, we would become head of departments or deans of faculties and sit on the Senate. Well, as part of, and you do that for a couple of years, and then you go back to your life as teaching and research. Well, that's all gone. Now we have professional deans and professional. The Senate is the legislative authority of universities is dominated by ex officio appointments appointed by the senior managers, including themselves. The academics don't now determine policy. So that's all part of neoliberalism. It's not the institution that's corrupt, it's the way it's the ideology that's imposed upon the institution. And I think that when you've got an ideology that encourages grifters, and, Shiloh mentioned the financial sector, the most unproductive, it has no productivity at all. When you examine the the total financial transactions on a daily basis, something like 99% of them add nothing to the well-being of society. The only ones that do are the forward contracts to manage risk for exchange rate risk for manufacturers where costs and revenue are in two different currencies, for example. The 99% of Wall Street transactions do nothing for the rest of us. It's just wealth shuffling. And when you've got that sort of ideology dominant, then of course you're going to get grifters who believe it's their right to take what they can get. That's the ideology, but it's not and you can say I'm optimistic and naive even. I don't believe that's the human condition. I believe that's an ideology, a dominant ideology. I believe that the human condition is essentially to help each other and to be good to each other. That's my naive belief, philosophical viewpoint. If I didn't hold that, then I wouldn't know where I would stand in life, basically.
Mm.
I think both live within all of us, and to some extent, like the perception of scarcity really drives people into one corner or the other, I think.
And I think that plays a little bit into what happened in the election here, because as we're talking about this, and I'm thinking about the emergence of a professional managerial class that lives within all of these really steadfast institutions, I kind of tend to associate those institutions with the left. Like the academy, I associate with the left. The medical system, I associate with the left. It's the very highly
But it's
trained.
like this weird new left thing that's,
It is.
no longer concerned with class struggles.
And this is what I mean, right? Where it's like you look at the results of the last election, and I'm like, I think that what those results are is a rejection of the way that these institutions have come to be structured and corrupted. And I don't think that it's a very productive rejection. Like, I think that anybody who looks at the two-party system and comes down on one side or the other is making a terrible, terrible mistake of judgment to not say that, hey, this whole playing field has become so corrupted that there's no way out of it, and we have to come up with some third alternative. But I think that the way that the numbers fell, I can't see it as anything except for a rejection of this idea that there's like a group of people that are basically like paid to push paper and to set agenda.
Yeah, I'd probably disagree with that to some extent. And remember, I'm an outsider, you're insiders, so bear that in mind. And that observation might mean that I've got better insight or less insight. I think I've got different insight to an insider. I think that's the best way we can say it. But look, when I saw Kamala Harris come out and say, "Oh, let's have joy," and a very sort of middle class aspiration. Let's be joyful again in America. And then you look at the income distribution data and the evolution of that over the last 20 years or even. And America is more advanced than most countries in hollowing out the middle class. The income distribution has become much more skewed. It was already very skewed relative to other countries. It's now much more skewed. The top end of town are getting massive disproportionate amount of the income produced each year, and that leads them to build up massive increases in wealth disparity in America.
It's very joyful for them.
Yeah, I mean, when you impose a sort of post-pandemic cost of living squeeze, that and you know, I've been to America often, and I think I understand its history, obviously, its institutional structure. I read a lot of American culture and stuff. So I'm not ignorant of the place. And I've also toured around extensively to some of those places in Texas and the southern states and even in suburbs of the big American cities in California and New York and New Jersey and some of the working class suburbs in the old industrial belt in Michigan and places like Wisconsin and places like that. And the living standards in those places is really abysmal now. The incursion of dope into those cities, like think about Baltimore, and that you've got whole cohorts of young people and their parents just sort of out of it now because there's nothing else for them. It's been hollowed out. And so when you say, oh, let's have joy, well, there's still a middle class left and they might aspire to joy because they're sort of coping a bit. But increasing numbers of Americans are not coping and are looking at a failed state for them. And so, yeah, there's this debate about whether it was sort of excessive wokeness that and political correctness that people have turned off and hate governments before. But I don't think that's the reason. I think it's just hand-to-mouth materialistic perception that America has stopped working for them and they've been abandoned by their governments who want to pursue all sorts of fancy schemes and not look after them. And I think, yeah, the vote in some states probably against Democrats probably reflected the Gaza issue. I think in Michigan, certainly the Democrats lost votes over the Palestinian issue, but I don't think that was widespread. I think that cost Michigan probably. But the southern states, Texas and Nevada and Arizona and Wisconsin and South Carolina and Georgia, I think that's purely economic and a consequence of Biden administration not looking after people in a time of crisis.
I think you can name more states than most Americans. That was really impressive, I must say.
Well, I mean, about being an outsider, I remember, and I don't want to be rude, but I saw a interview with an American professor, and they were questioning Americans on their geographic knowledge of the world.
Oh boy.
And hardly any American could say what city belonged to which country. And I remember I also heard an interview on national radio in Australia with this American professor who was coming down. It was about the middle of May. And he said, oh, by the way, what month is it down there? And I think it's well known that Americans are relatively insular and countries like Australia, because of our size and our location, are plugged into the rest of the world. So that's true, yeah.
I think you're right about all those factors that you pointed out. I also think there was this sense of inhumanness to the establishment party, right? Like there's the candidate that ultimately prevailed has this real, like, down to earth, says whatever he thinks kind of thing, and people have gotten really suspicious of big brother bureaucrat style people who can't talk without a cue card. Like, I think I really feel like that's what lost the election for them personally, because I feel like there are issue voters for sure, but it would have been very, very close. And there was something about that inability of them to front a candidate who could just be themselves in a productive way that just really creeped people out who were on the fence.
Yeah, I think two other points I'd make is that I think the migration issue, whether it was valid or not, was quite powerful. Um, and that relates to this idea of, well, even second generation migrants voted for Trump because they got in legitimately. And what are all these characters running across the Rio Grande doing? And but the other point,
Some of the most anti-immigration people that I have met in my entire life in America are immigrants themselves.
yeah, it's like some of the most vehement anti-smokers are the ones who have given up smoking. So it's that sense of entitlement that you get from doing something. But I think the other point you make was really valid. And from the outside, Kamala Harris was a dreadful candidate. I mean, getting
You
over.
say from the outside as if from the inside she must have looked really good.
No, I don't know from the inside because I'm not there. But and there could be cultural nuances. But watching her interviews and her way of speaking and her avoidance, she was pathetic. And Trump, look, Trump's a sort of force of nature, isn't he? He's a big bloke, and he resonates with things that a lot of ordinary working class people can understand, even though he's not remotely like that. But he's able to portray, and his marketing and his imagery was very successful. They did it very well. That he was a man of the people. I'm going to save you from these criminals coming from the south, and I'm going to give you your jobs back again. I mean, it's not remotely possible he's going to be able to fulfill his mandate. He might be able to build more of the wall, possibly, and he's probably going to be able to deport people, and maybe, but. And I think he will be more successful than he was in his first term, because I think he's become much more politically astute, and he doesn't have to accept the mainstream Republican appointees to his administration. He can select his mates like Elon and these crazy characters, JFK Jr. and that other guy. It's just it's almost traumatic to think about it. But he was very successful, and he's a man of the people. And the working class people, desperate economic circumstances, they've got a lot of fear. I think you can answer this if I'll be the interviewer, but I sense that Americans are despite all the sort of rah, we're the best in the world, I sense the Americans are seeing the slide of its national power in relation to China. China is going to become much more clever, much more dominant, and they're doing things to reinforce that dominance. And America is losing its credibility in the world, and it's losing its position in the world. It's looking more and more like a failed state.
Losing our edge.
Life in Portugal several hundred years after the empire has collapsed seems quite nice. And so I look forward to the sunset of the empire. I think it's going to be a slower life. It's going to be a simpler life and a poorer life. But I don't know. I'm very pessimistic about these things. I'm genuinely shocked that people still know how to read. Like with the rise of, I don't know how much time you spend on YouTube or any social media site, but it's basically, I think it's military grade psychological weapons. Like I have known kids that spend 8 hours a day scrolling almost every single day. And so something is terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, and there's not really a lot of political will to fix it. And I don't think that you can run a society with 95% of people having been one-shotted by their cell phones. And I speak as somebody who, my dad was in the computer industry, and he gave me a laptop when I was like 10 with no limits on it, right? It was just in my room. And so I know what that does to a kid's brain. And that was even before the internet was delectable. This was just, like spending time on forums and reading news groups or whatever. But even that was very just enthralling. Like it's bottomless. There's just this infinite depth and you can fall into it. And so I see kids getting addicted to it in a way that freaks me out terribly, because parents, they just give these kids these computers. Oh, I read something astoundingly horrifying. Okay, so there's this YouTube channel called Coco Melon, and Coco Melon makes videos for children. And they're categorically different from what we think of as programming for children in the past, like Mr. Rogers. Is that the guy with the cardigan? Sesame Street, all these things. Because what they do is they engineer it. Like they'll get kids to sit down in front of a reel of whatever version of the episode they're making, and then they have something that's called the distractatron, which is playing scenes of regular life, like somebody getting a haircut or making coffee, like regular adult life things. And they will sit the kids down in front of the episode, and anytime that they break from the episode and looked at the distractatron, they know that they have to retool the episode to make it more weapons grade addictive, so that the kids maintain their focus for the entire time of the episode. And then if they're watching it on YouTube, it just feeds them like hours of this stuff.
Yeah, it's a real worry. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I read recently that 52% of Americans have not completed high school.
I don't know about that. I don't have my phone to look it up either. Do you know?
Yeah, so it's I think that's true, and it's a high proportion, if anyway, whatever the actual number is. And you think about that in terms of your ability to comprehend sophisticated narratives and your sort of awareness of the world. If a person who hasn't completed secondary school is not very knowledgeable, and in my view, has less ability to resist the sort of Trumpian type narratives that's thrown at them. And
I think that they just have less ability to resist any of the narratives that are thrown at them. And I think that there's a lot of narrative warfare that's happening right now. And in context of what we were talking about earlier, it seems like this idea of narrative warfare has been happening since the 70s. And now we have that the right got really good at narrative warfare. Fox News is kind of the epitome of that. I think Tucker Carlson has one of the biggest podcasts in the world now. And I think that the problem is that what the left is going to try to do is the left is going to try to do psychological warfare in a way that's as good as the right. And I'm like,
they can't. They can't.
You don't think so?
No, they historically haven't been able to. A, because they aren't embedded in capital in the same way that the right are, so they can't fund it. And B, they're a much more heterogeneous group. Their motivations and aspirations are much more heterogeneous, which means that they fall out with each other more often. I've seen it over and over. There was a debate as an example, a trivial example, but there's been a long-standing debate as to whether post-Keynesian economics is capital P, capital K, small p, capital K, large P, hyphen capital K. It's sort of, what's that Monty Python thing? The armies of whatever, There's a skit about how all these do-gooders splinter into all different factions and groups, and that splintering then becomes the cause. And I think if you analyse history, the left has been fractured by nuance and triviality and mindless vanities and stuff. And the right, I think, historically have been much better funded and much more unilateral in their goal seeking. because essentially they can distill it all down to, we want more, let's get it. Whereas the left want feminist, gender, Black Lives Matter, all of these things that can easily be divided and conquered. And the right are incredibly skilled at dividing and conquering the left. You know, feminists will tell you that, oh, the boss who's a female has more in common with the low-paid female workers than the low-paid female workers have with the low-paid male workers. Well, you've immediately split the working class. That you've got the boss apparently sympathetic with one section of the working class and the other who's hostile to the other because they're men or women, whichever way you want to take it. And, you know, all sorts of stuff. And
literally anything except for wealth distribution. And it's like, do you think there's a hope that there could actually be not a shallow left like the one that we see in the Democratic Party, but one that's truly concerned with the growing gap in income, growing income inequality gap?
Look, paradigm shift, that's the first thing. I've lived through one major paradigm shift in economic thinking and the ideology associated with that and the policy structures. But I think the other thing history tells us is that civilizations collapse. Civilizations collapse. We've had great historical epochs, you know, the Roman Empire and Carthaginian Empire and the Chinese dynasties and you just have to look at Japanese history. Civilizations collapse, and I suspect that we're approaching what we're seeing more now is a reflection that the capitalist system, which has dominated this era of human existence, is reaching at the end game. I think it's becoming dysfunctional. And I think, moreover, I think that the environmental challenge, the climate shifts, are going to force an end to this current civilization. And the problem is that humanity is too disorganised and too stupid to manage the shift itself. And so, like all civilization shifts, typically they end with a chaotic event and chaos, which from that something's restored that goes forward as being acceptable until the next crunch. And I think we're at that stage of history now. I think America's in decline. Capitalism is in decline. The financial markets we've moved from industrial capital to finance capital. And that's now dominant, and that does nothing but cause instability and inequality. And I think we're facing a massive climate crisis. Humanity now is using resources at 1.7 times the regenerative capital of the biosphere. Well, that can't continue. We've got to somehow, degrowth is either going to be chosen or forced upon us, and I suspect it'll be forced upon us. And at that point, what emerges is will it be a good left, a progressive new era? I don't know. I'm pessimistic, unfortunately.
A little depressing. I like to end these on a higher note, but I think that it gives us some...
I mean, this is something we're going to keep exploring on the show. So we actually just did a podcast with an analyst talking about collapse of civilization. I've reached out to a few more people who are experts in complex society collapse and looking at the ways in which it can be subverted and what tactics have worked at that in the past and so forth. But yeah, I tend to agree that there's a lot of things that look like they're on the breaking point. But I don't know, Bill, we've done 3 hours here, man. It's been so fascinating talking to you. This time has just flown by, and I realized we didn't get into half the things that we'd meant to. But
I have a long list of questions.
But at the same time, yeah, it's good to process all that we've gone through so far.
Well, thank you. And if there's value, you can invite me back. But otherwise, thanks very much. And it was a daunting prospect for me to sit down for a 3-hour talk. But I also hate superficial exchanges where someone just wants 10 minutes of your time and you can't get anywhere. And so, yeah, it's interesting dynamic, actually. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time and for coming by and all of your insights on the history, the present, and the future.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'd love to have you back. We should definitely get this out, and so we can get the audience's comments and see what pieces people feel need more attention and so forth. But yeah, it's been fascinating to talk to you. And oh, by the way, before you go, everybody should check out your music. What's the name of your band? It's awesome. You do this. Your music's fantastic. I was listening to it just the other day.
My band is called Pressure Drop.
Pressure Drop. That's right. That's right. Yeah, everybody check it out. It's actually a kind of. Could I call it a reggae? Is it reggae?
A reggae band.
It's reggae, which is incredible because you're such a straight-laced intellectual. But when you think of reggae, you think of these Rastafarians off on cloud nine.
It's just resistance. It's the evolution of R&B and jazz, and so that it's exactly in the sort of era that I came into music, jazz and R&B and soul music. It's just an extension of that, and it's rebel music. It's resistance music. It's anti-establishment music. It's an expression of the angst of the people, and it's also has beautiful elements, expression of our care for each other and stuff. So it's good.
I love it.
And it sounds simple, but diabolically difficult to play if you've grown up on the 1 and the 3. You have to go on the 2 and the 4. So it's very demanding.
It's really groovy stuff. I enjoy it as well.
Yeah, I'm inspired. All right, well, we'll let you go for today.
Yeah, we'll reach out again in the new year. The next month or so is a little wonky for us, but after that, we'll reach out again. We'll find a time.
All the best. Take care.
You as
See
well.
you later.
All right, see you. Bye everybody.